It was one of the first topics that was brought up when we all learned that USC and UCLA were going to be joining the Big Ten in 2024. Could the Trojans and the Bruins handle the harsh Big Ten Midwestern Novembers? It's a question that needs to be talked about, but I'm not sure it's going to be as big of a deal as some people think. Before I get into that, just a reminder, hit subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Big Ten football content all offseason long. Always mash that like button to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses. A lot of times when you're watching Big Ten games, those rivalry games in the final week of the season, okay, you saw snow when you saw Penn State and Michigan State. You've seen weather, cold of some kind when you talk Michigan and Ohio State. But here's the deal. When USC and UCLA enter the conference in 2024, they're going to play each other that final week of the regular season. That's probably how the Big Ten schedule is going to shape out, right? You're playing your arch rival the last week of the season, Ohio State, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Northwestern, Ohio State, Michigan. All of those rivalries will be played the final week of the season. And USC and UCLA will be the West Coast version of that in the Big Ten Conference. So that takes away the last weekend of the regular season, that Thanksgiving Saturday, which is when you start to see a lot of this Big Ten weather start to kick in. And when we talk about the really harsh weather, because I think that's the only weather that we really have to worry about when we talk about USC and UCLA. A lot of that, and a lot of this is going to come from experience. I was born and raised in our north of Madison, Wisconsin. I'm currently living in one of the coldest markets in the Big Ten, if not one of the coldest markets in all of college football, in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So if somebody knows cold, it's probably your boy, Big Ten Ted. So you're really going to have to worry about the third weekend in November, the second weekend in November, because that's when it really starts to turn at least a little bit. I'm going to contradict myself here just a minute. Third weekend in November, this last weekend, right? The weekend before rivalry Saturday. Iowa played Minnesota this past year at Huntington Bank Stadium here in Minneapolis, and it was in the single digits. It was windy. I remember it was a very cold weekend leading up to that game between the Hawkeyes and the Gophers, and the weather certainly affected the style of play, but these are two programs, Iowa and Minnesota, that have been adjusted to this and know what Big Ten football and know what Big Ten weather is all about. So there are going to be weekends, third Saturday in November, second Saturday in November, where it might get a little chilly. Okay, but I believe the only places where it's going to get that, where it's really going to get harsher than maybe USC and UCLA is used to, they've gone up to Oregon, they've gone up to Washington, they've gone up to the Pacific Northwest, where it maybe dips into the 40s, it dips into the 30s, so they can handle that. But Pullman, Washington, but when it gets to the harsh, your 20s, your 10s, your single digits, you want to avoid Minnesota. You want to avoid Wisconsin, then you could maybe throw in Iowa, and you could throw in Nebraska in there as well. You get anywhere other than south than that, you look at Illinois, you look at Northwestern, you look at Ohio, and then maybe Pennsylvania. You might get snow, but I don't think you're getting the harsh temperatures that you're getting up here in the north when you look at Minnesota and you look at Wisconsin. So USC and UCLA needs to find a way to get all buddy-buddy with the new Big Ten commissioner and scheduling committee to make sure they avoid the Badger State in the land of 10,000 lakes in the months of November. But that being said, as a resident, I've seen unseasonably warm, second week in November, third week in November. I've seen 40s. I've seen 30s, 40s, sometimes 50s, those weeks around here as well. So that's, I think, the thing that's going to be different for them is the unpredictability. That's what Midwestern weather is all about. It's about 1 week, one day it's 10 degrees, 2 days later it's 35. That's the hard thing, because when USC and UCLA, they went to Arizona, they went to the desert, they generally knew what kind of weather they were going to get. They went to the Bay Area, Stanford and Cal. You generally knew what kind of, it was fairly predictable, I think, out west, what you were going to get weather-wise. When you go to the Midwest, there's a lot of unpredictability, right? Later, and I can't remember when this was during the 2022 season, but you had in Indiana and Illinois, you had winds whipping around. Ask Ohio State, how they liked playing in that when they had to go to Northwestern and escape with a 21-7 victory. I think there are going to be adjustments for USC and UCLA when they come over to the Big Ten, adjusting to that weather, right? And it's not just the cold. It's not just the bitter cold. Okay, and I honestly don't think they're going to see that many bitter cold games because I only think it's going to be up here in Wisconsin, Minnesota. Okay, outside of that, they're going to have to deal with wind. They're going to have to deal with rain. Like, they're going to have to deal with things that they've maybe had to deal with in the past. I don't know if a lot of this is going to be too different for USC and UCLA. But I will say this in terms of adjustments that the Bruins and the Trojans will have to make. Okay, Lincoln Riley and Chip Kelly are used to being able to throw it around kind of whenever they want. All right? So what I see in this scenario is, you get a snow game, you get a cold game, you get a windy game, you get kind of some of this Midwestern weather. You're going to have to adjust your offense on the fly. Okay, because right now when I look at the Trojans and I look at the Bruins, I see teams that with very good quarterbacks like to throw the ball, not very physical, and they don't play great defense. When you get into the weather games, if USC gets into a weather game against Wisconsin, against an Iowa, where you have to play great defense and you're not able to move the football through the air as much, right? The wind and everything, Windy City down there in Chicago near Evanston and everything. There's so many different types of weather I think that USC and UCLA are going to have to deal with in November. I think that's going to be an adjustment. There needs to be more diversity on the offensive side of the ball for the Trojans and the Bruins. They are going to have to adapt to the Big Ten style of play. A lot of times, that's running the football. Focusing in on your running game and being able to do that. A lot of times, we've seen Ohio State go over the top and play well in that respect. But there have been times where the Buckeyes have needed to run the ball, and it hasn't turned out that way. So the Trojans and the Bruins, if they want to be really successful in the Big Ten, they're going to have to adjust to all kind of climates across the Big Ten. Overall, I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. I think it's just going to happen in spots. I think it's just going to happen in pockets outside of Minnesota, outside of Wisconsin, maybe Iowa, and maybe Nebraska. I don't think you're going to get that harsh weather that USC and UCLA is not used to, right? They've got Utah and Colorado in their conference. They've played in mountain weather, right? They've played in the Pacific Northwest. So those types of conditions, the 30s, the 40s, that kind of stuff, I don't think it's unfamiliar to them. It's the harsh changing of different climates, but they're going to have to adapt. They're going to have to evolve. They're going to have to adjust to be full members of the Big Ten Conference. I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think USC and UCLA are going to have a hard time adjusting to the Big Ten weather conditions, or is this really just a bunch of hullabaloo? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.